Jeff Beck's Truth has been described as the premiere of heavy metal. It's certainly one of the most undersung yet influential albums of the late 60s, and one you simply must have in your collection. On July 29, 1968, Jeff Beck, a jobbing Celtic fan, a Rolling Stone, and a clattering drummer, released the seminal album that is Truth. An album described by Louder Sound as a miracle of fury and berserk beauty. It was a powerful statement by a 24-year-old guitarist, no doubt licking his wounds from his tenure in the Yardbirds. We get 10 tracks that fluctuate between R&B, electric blues, psychedelically infused rock, classical, and some pretty heavy guitar. An album described as proto-metal by so many. It's an arresting album, there's no doubt about that. Came out a few months before the punishing, bludgeoning debut of Led Zeppelin. It features, of course, Jeff Beck, Rod Stewart, Ronnie Wood on bass, and drummer Mickey Waller, who made an album, effectively, that would go on to influence a whole generation of rock guitarists. But Jeff Beck, ever self-effacing, said of this record, "We decided it was about time we recorded some of the rubbish we'd been playing on stage." Jeff Beck's Truth is an important album, and it tends to be eclipsed by the stratospheric rumblings of Cream or the delta of Led Zeppelin, not to mention the psychedelic textures of Electric Ladyland. But it's a record that never really carried its reputation in the same way and is often overlooked. AllMusic attributes this to the erratic nature of Beck's subsequent work. It's true that this album over the years has retreated into the shadows of some of those bands I've just mentioned. But its experimentalism and vision is one that's been imbibed and regurgitated by 1,000 rock and metal guitarists since. On this album we get the familiar tubercular rasp of Rod Stewart, that heavy bass tone of Ron Wood, and Mickey Waller on drums, of course. Also guests Jimmy Page, Keith Moon, and John Paul Jones, all sticking their oars in. But it's Beck's virtuosity and lead guitar work on this that is remarkable. And it's easy to see why this album is seen as some kind of holy grail by many rock guitarists. In fact, Mick Box, being interviewed for this channel, said of this album,
I'm interested. One of the things that defines the Uriah Heep sound is that wah-wah sound, that guitar sound. I'm just wondering how big a influence was somebody like Hendrix, and what other guitarists were a huge influence on your sound?
Oh no, the wah-wah was definitely Jeff Beck.
Oh, okay, yeah.
With the Truth album. That was mind-blowing to me, because he made it talk, he made it aggressive, he made it snarl, it made it really sweet, it had everything. And again, I heard that and went, wow, that's for me.
This album begins with a reconfiguring of the Yardbirds' Shapes of Things. We also get the filling, loosening version of Willie Dixon's You Shook Me, a version of Jerome Kern's Old Man River, reconfigured as a slow electric blues, and a brief plunge into the stylings of the English Renaissance with an acoustic rendering of Greensleeves. The album didn't do too badly, got to number 15 in the US charts, which is not bad for someone who was completely and utterly unknown just 6 months earlier. There's no doubt that Jeff Beck had become a force to reckon with in 1968. Just prior to that, of course, he replaced Eric Clapton in the Yardbirds. Eric Clapton, ever the blues purist, felt unhappy with the more commercial direction the Yardbirds were taking. For Your Love, of course, was a very successful song for the Yardbirds, written by Graham Gouldman, which apparently boiled Clapton's piss somewhat. Of course, Graham Gouldman would go on to write Tallyman for Jeff Beck as well. But Truth smashes genre conventions at every turn. We get Willie Dixon's You Shook Me and I Ain't Superstitious, a masterly reinvented Old Man River, as well as the aforementioned Tudor noodling, which is Greensleeves. These are all offered up to the listener on a smorgasbord of an album. 1968 was a great year for music. The Beatles put out their seminal White Album, Free released tons of sobs, Cream put out Wheels of Fire, the Stones' Beggar's Banquet, of course, as well as Hendrix' release of Electric Ladyland. Jeff Beck was forming his own band at this time, the same way Clapton had done with Cream, although Cream were only about a year away from disbanding. Jimmy Page was commandeering his own brand of punishing blues, but this band struggled with drummers. I think to get the right drummer, they went through quite a few, including Pretty Things, Viv Prince, Rod Coombs, later the Strawbs, and Ainsley Dunbar. Eventually, of course, Mickey Waller was auditioned, let go, then rehired. And this quartet then went into Abbey Road Studios on May the 14th, 1968 to begin recording. Apparently it was one of the first independent sessions that was allowed in Abbey Road, recalled Truth engineer Ken Scott. You Shook Me is an old blues number written by Willie Dixon, originally recorded by Muddy Waters. The song was on Truth and then refashioned by Led Zeppelin for their debut album some months later. Rod Stewart accuses Page and Plant of stealing it from them after they saw the Jeff Beck Group perform it live. Of course, Jimmy Page had this to add. The Jeff Beck Group, You Shook Me, and Zeppelin's version appear to have the same DNA. You've got to understand that Beck and I come from the same sort of roots, he said. I don't know he'd done it, and he didn't know we'd done it. And something smells a bit fishy, quite frankly. Old Memory River is an interesting one. It's a Hammerstein, Oscar Hammerstein, Jerome Kern standard. Features Jeff Beck on bass and John Paul Jones on Hammond organ. John Paul Jones, who was a seasoned session man who played with many great guitarists, including Richie Blackmore, was absolutely mesmerised by Beck. He said the problem with Jeff Beck is, quote, he could have been as big as Led Zeppelin, but he's just not consistent enough. Blues Deluxe is one that masquerades as a live number, but it wasn't really. The audience was added to it later on. A little bit of faux sort of live performance, a bit like Big Brother's Cheap Thrills album. Beck laughed. Apparently, we just added a bit of the Beatles' reception at the Empire Hall, Wembley. Let Me Love You sounds a little bit strange brewish. You get Little Girl, which has a nice chilled feel to it. Tim Rose's Morning Dew, I think the Grateful Dead's version is probably the most famous version. But it's interesting on here that Beck's wah-wah guitar is so loud. You've almost got like a call and response with Rod's vocals. It does seem a little bit high in the mix, quite frankly. Nevertheless, I think Bonnie Dobson, who originally sung this song before Garcia, would have probably enjoyed the sound of the bagpipes in the original recording, the Beck recording, that is. I Ain't Superstitious actually starts off like a Yardbirds number. What's extraordinary is the range of sounds that Beck gets from his guitar using his wah-wah pedal. Sounds like a dog barking at one point. It all generally eases around Rod Stewart's lucid singing. I have to say almost, I don't know, probably about 55 years since this album came out. It has the ability to make you long for a time when such albums were made. It's a groundbreaking and eclectic album that has influenced so many. And therefore I would argue that it's a record that you must have in your collection. Anyway, you've been watching a video by Classic Album Review. If you enjoyed this, please do click like, subscribe and check that notification bell. And check some of the links below this video for ways you can support the sterling work done at this channel. I will leave you with my closing salvo, which is, as you know, hope you're well, staying safe, but more importantly that you keep listening.